On today's episode of Faith and Focus, I want to discuss the world system, the cosmos, as it's called in the Bible. This system set up by Satan to rule the world and to keep people from God, essentially. And I want to discuss a couple books that tie into what I'm thinking about this, and really how we as Christians should be skeptical and hesitant to interact with the world system, at least interact with the world system with our eyes shut. We should be fully aware with what we're engaging in. So that's what we're going to discuss on this episode. The world system. It is this topic that is discussed throughout the Bible, and a concept that I don't know that is necessarily thought of too much. Unfortunately, I think this is probably a tactic used by Satan to distract us as Christians, but it's a topic that we don't think about a whole lot. And I guess what I mean by that is, that's not to say that Christians don't spend a lot of time talking about sin and worldliness. Certainly we do, but I think that we talk about it in a very superficial way. And I guess what I mean by that is we tend to focus on things that are obvious, things that even unbelievers, for the most part, would be like, yeah, this is probably not wise. You probably shouldn't engage in these things. We'll talk about pornography use, just illicit sexual behavior, which would be damaging, that most unbelievers, even though they might be soft on it, would be like, okay, yeah, this is damaging. Drug use, drinking, things that are clearly destructive and demonstrably destructive. Even the world, you don't even need a biblical worldview necessarily to look at those things and be like, yeah, these things are probably not beneficial or edifying anyway. So the church readily, and not inappropriately, but readily harps on those things. But again, they're things that even moral teachings in the world would caution against. So what I think that we avoid talking about is the deeper issues of what the world system is and how the church should view the world and the system of the world, all of the systems of the world, things set up by Satan. Whether this is just culture, fads, politics, entertainment, all of this stuff. Things that are not necessarily evil in and of themselves. In fact, as we'll see, part of the disengagement, I guess, disengaged thinking that I think Christians have towards the world system is specifically because these things are not in and of themselves evil, and in their individual choices that we might make that have no moral component to them, but in totality, there's a life centered around making decisions that are not, again, morally evil, but are just passively going along with the world system, not understanding that I think that's Satan's intent. If Satan was to approach us as Christians, like he's often portrayed in horror films, then he probably wouldn't get a large following. However, and again, remember, Satan is a wise being, much wiser than any of us, much more intelligent than any of us, and he's been around longer than any of us. So he's playing the long game. So he doesn't need to come to a Christian and get them to go from 0 to 100 as far as sin and or worldly, quote unquote, worldly living, he doesn't need to do that in a week and a half. Or he doesn't need to get somebody to go on a weekend bender and completely destroy their life. I mean, I think he would love to do that, but he realizes that for the most part, people who are Christians or even just moral people have a conscience. They're probably not going to engage in a lot of the things that might initially tempt them, but he's playing the long game. So if it takes him 20 years to destroy a person's life, I mean, Jesus said that Satan is a murderer. He's been a murderer from the beginning. He's the thief as opposed to the good shepherd. He comes only to steal and destroy. If it takes him 20, 30 years to destroy a person, he's perfectly fine doing that. So when we operate in the world system, 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 through 17, it tells us, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Because all that's in the world, the desire of the flesh and the desire of the eyes and the arrogance produced by material possessions, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away with all of its desires. But the person who does the will of God remains forever. So this is the world system. I mean, everything that's in the world is fighting against God. And their system set up by Satan. So they might not be evil in and of themselves, but Satan's end goal in using the world system is to draw us away from God. I think that all Christians would agree with that basic premise. What we don't agree on, obviously, is, because to not love the world system, we're told not to love the world system. Well, any Christian is going to say, well, yeah, if the love of the world means that I don't have the love of the Father in me, then I don't want to admit that I don't have the love of the Father in me, so I don't want to admit that I love the world system, so whatever engagement I have with the world system doesn't cross the line into loving it, but I can certainly find other people who love the world more than I do, and they're the ones that John's talking to. So we never put ourselves into that category of somebody who loves the world system. We just kind of passively move through life uncritically examining, well, if I love the world system and I'm being deceived by the world system, how would I know? And so I think that's what Satan tends to do, is he lures us in with things that are not immediately dangerous or evil, and he hooks us like a fish being caught by a hook and lure. And once that hook is set for this love of the world, we're going to continue down that path, and to the point where we do end up becoming destroyed. I mean, that is the kind of the picture that we get of sin in the Bible. Is, of course, in a theological sense, all sin causes death. But when you look at like Romans 6, James chapter 1, sin is kind of pictured almost like death is the fruition of sin. And so sin might start with a desire, and this is kind of the picture James gives. It's sin starts as a desire or a lust, and then it is conceived with presumably our choice to act on those desires, and then those things give birth to sin, and then sin matures like a baby born, and then grows up and matures, and then results in death. So it's kind of like the world system is designed to take our desires and cause us to act on them, and then produce something that then grows up and matures into death. Obviously, if it was presented to us as death right from the get-go, we might not be as susceptible to it, but that's not how Satan's operating. Kind of a very profound yet kind of minimalist quote, very succinct quote that Andy Stanley says, I really love, is he says, people do not plan to mess up their lives. They just don't plan not to. And I think, wow, isn't that a perfect synopsis of how the world system operates, right? It sucks us in, and we're not planning to end up far from God and distant from God and alienated from God and his people and the will of God. And living a destructive life of sin. We don't plan that. No, even moral people don't plan to have their life. Just moral unbelievers don't have their plan to have their life destroyed. And Christians don't plan. No Christian has this plan to live for the world and hate God and hate the church. I mean, none of that stuff is a plan, but there's just not a conscious plan not to. So the world can creep in and draw us in such a way that it leads us to that end. It leads us down that path. There's a great book. It's a small book, but about 100 or so pages, by Watchman Nee, called "Love Not the World," and as the title suggests, it's based on that passage in 1 John. Now, I don't agree with obviously everything in the book. Watchman Nee has some beliefs that are kind of out in left field, but he has this section, and I want to read it in its entirety because I think it perfectly synopsizes what I'm trying to discuss and hopefully get us thinking about more. I know when I read it, I was just like, wow, that really helps illustrate and kind of change my worldview, no pun intended, on how to think of the world. So I want to read this section from his book, Love Not the World. And he says, "Every one of us, having been in bondage to sin, we readily believe that sinful things are satanic. But do we believe equally that the things of the world are satanic? Many of us, I think, are still of two minds about this. Yet how clearly Scripture affirms that the whole world lieth in the evil one. Satan well knows that, generally speaking, to try to ensnare real Christians through things that are positively sinful is vain and futile. They will usually sense the danger and elude him. So he has contrived instead an enticing network, the mesh of which is so skillfully woven as to entrap the most innocent of men. We flee sinful lust, and with good reason. But when it comes to such seemingly innocuous things as science and art and education, how readily do we lose our sense of values and fall a prey to his enticements. When mention is made of a dance hall or a nightclub, our reaction as Christians is one of instinctive disapproval. To us, that is the world par excellence. When, however, to go to the other extreme, medical science or social service are discussed, there may be no such reaction at all. These things command our tacit approval and maybe our enthusiastic support. And between these extremes, there lies a host of other things, varying widely in their influence for good or bad, between which none of us would probably agree on where to draw an exact line. Yet let us face the fact that judgment has been pronounced by God not upon certain selected things that belong to this world, but impartially upon them all. Test yourself. If you venture into one of these approved fields, and then someone exclaims to you, "You have touched the world there," will you be moved? Probably not at all. It takes someone whom you really respect to say to you very straightly and earnestly, "Brother, you have become involved with Satan there," before you will so much as hesitate. Is that not so? How would you feel if anyone said to you, "You have touched education there," or "You have touched medical science," or "You have touched commerce"? Would you react with the same degree of caution as you would if he had said, "You have touched the devil there"? If we truly believe that whenever we touch any of these things that constitute the world, we touch the prince of this world, then the awful seriousness of being in any ways involved in worldly things could not fail to strike home to us. The whole world lieth in the evil one, not a part of it, but the whole. Do not let us think for a moment that Satan opposes God only by means of sin and carnality in men's hearts. He opposes God by means of every worldly thing. Oh, I agree with you that the things of the world are all in one sense material, lifeless, intrinsically without power to harm us, yet even that itself should suggest that they are resistant to the purpose of God, as indeed is everything in which there is no touch of divine life. So what is he saying? He's saying that everything is the world. Your education, college, high school, your public school education, your career, the car you drive, the book you read, the novel you pick up, everything. Even the G-rated movie you watch. We might draw lines and say, well, you can't watch rated R movies, but even the G-rated one is part of the world. It all falls into what constitutes the world. And so what Watchman Nee is suggesting is that all of it is in the hands of the evil one. All of them are tools at his disposal that he can use to draw Christians away from God, and that he will use to draw people away from God. And he will come at people with different tactics and enticements, but his desire is the same. He wants to steal, kill, destroy. You can easily obviously think of this, somebody who's just a strong, independent, hardworking man or woman. Well, Satan can entice them with a promising career and prestige in the workplace, and that draws them away. And there's nothing wrong to be admired at work. In fact, Christians are called upon to have such stellar work performance that we stand head and shoulders above the people of the world because we're serving as unto the Lord. But you can see how something as simple as that, something as uncritical as that, if you just enter into a workplace without thinking of it as serving the Lord, without bringing it before the lordship of Christ, well, then you will just be passively entering into the world system, into a tool that could be being used by Satan. And as Andy Stanley says, you may not be planning to abandon God in your walk with God by pursuing excellence in your career, but you're not planning not to. And that's the dangerous part. So obviously this trickles down to, just very practical things. We can see it in our own lives. And I think we see it in the way people think nowadays. It's very popular online. You'll see memes, or maybe you've even said something like this or seen things like this, that people will lament the fact that, well, our parents could live on one income and afford to buy houses, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s or whatever. And now, we work 2 or 3 jobs and we can't even afford the smallest house. And first of all, that's not true. That is an overgeneralization and a lie. Now, there may be places, like if you wanted to live in San Francisco or New York City, that you may not be able to afford while working at Taco Bell or something like that. Nothing against Taco Bell. But sure, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. But, I know people who have bought and own homes on one income. It's not impossible. But another thing that we have to consider is that 30 and 40 years ago, buying a home was an absolute necessity. When people bought their home, that was their that was what they viewed as their main priority, their main bill to pay. And so a lot of luxuries, things that we have now that we think of as necessities, are not necessities. They didn't exist 30 years ago. Obviously, they weren't needed for life. And so there are things that have complicated our lives financially, and things that we don't even realize, that we've never really taken inventory of, that complicate our financial situation to where we think, man, I can't even afford a house anymore. Now, let me give you just kind of a brief example. Cell phones are thought to be indispensable to public life. If you say, well, a cell phone's not a necessity, people will say, well, no, they are. Even for emergency purposes, if you get into an accident, you need to have a cell phone. And I think, well, people got into accidents 20 years ago, and they didn't have cell phones. What did people do then? If you got into an accident back then, you walked up to somebody's front door and knocked on their door and called them, or somebody stopped and, gave you a ride or whatever. So it's not a necessity. It's definitely a convenience, but it's not a necessity. And certainly not the kinds of phones that we use. And especially now with everyone has a cell phone. If you don't own one and you absolutely need one, you just stop a random person and ask if you can borrow theirs. And unless they're completely psychotic, they probably would let you use it. But regardless, you don't need to have the best of the best cell phone. So I kind of looked online and thought, well, what does the average cell phone cost? And, if you're looking at iPhones, they're like $1,000. Now you might get, a deal where you get one for free. But once you get a cell phone, a smartphone like that, you've got to pay for your plan. You got to pay for the data package that comes with it. So the average cell phone plan comes out to be about $115 a month. Just to have that fancy phone that's an absolute necessity. Well, you might buy a laptop for, $500, $600, $700, which is not a necessity, but it's a nice luxury to have. Well, once you have your phone and your computer, well, now I kind of need, cable internet. And, man, if I bundle it with cable TV, I get a little bit better deal. So, the average cable internet plan, another $115, $120. Well, I've got a nice TV, and I've got cable internet and my phone, and it'd be kind of dumb to not be able to watch anything on it. So, I'm going to get Netflix. It's $10 a month. I'm going to get Hulu, $7 a month. And there's a show I really like on HBO Max, so that's $15 a month. And, it's cheaper to buy Spotify for a month rather than keep buying CDs or whatever. And so that's $10 a month. And then you might throw in another generic streaming service for another $10 a month. So you're looking at another $55, $60-ish in these streaming services. And then I got to have a car. That's certainly a necessity, and no one would begrudge us that. But, I kind of want to have a nicer car, so I'm gonna buy a new-ish or newer car. And so the average car payment is $350 a month. Again, you have to have a car, whether it has to be one that's that expensive. Either way, that tends to be the average. So rather than buying a car outright or buying a cheaper one that you may only have to pay $100 a month, people tend to gravitate towards the newer one, paying $350 a month. If your vehicle's if you have a loan out on your car, you have to have full coverage. The average full coverage insurance is about $200 a month. So you're looking at $550 per car. If you're married, you got to double that. So you're looking at another $1,000 a month to have these nicer luxury vehicles. Even if you were to cut that in half and say, I don't need as nice of a vehicle, but we have two of them, we have to have full coverage. You're still looking at $500 something a month. The average cost of eating out, which certainly back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s would have been absolute luxuries. They would not have been regular things like we do now. The average cost of eating out is $200 per month. Entertainment is about $250 a month on average, minus the $50 or so you're spending on streaming. You're still looking at $200 a month eating out, whatever, going to movies, bowling, dance classes, I don't know, whatever people do for entertainment. You total all that up, that's about $1,200 worth of things that are not necessities. They're just luxuries that we like to enjoy. And they add up, and so if you were to say, well, man, I'm going to eliminate even half of that, well, that's $600, $700 a month on luxuries that could go towards a house. So the inability to buy a house actually comes from, you've allocated your resources elsewhere. Now, what typically happens is people have all of those entertainment costs because this is how the world operates, right? Everything I listed there, none of those things were evil things. They're all morally neutral. I guess what you use streaming stuff for could maybe have a moral component to it, but they're all moral components, can be used for good or evil, but they just creep in on you and you don't even realize how much it has complicated your financial life now. And well, I still have to get a house, I guess, so I got to get a house, and now I've added on hundreds more for home insurance, your mortgage, maintenance on your house every month. And because I have all of these things that are necessities that I can't cut out any of them, they're all intertwined. You almost can't even separate how much they're intertwined. Then comes in the need, this pressure for this high pressure, high paying job. We can't have the freedom to choose what kind of job or career I want. That hey, I live a relatively simple life financially. I can pick a career on my own terms. And like Andy Stanley said, you don't plan to complicate your life to the point where you have no control over your own freedom to serve the Lord, but you don't plan not to. So then you get tied up into this, and again, don't think that this isn't what Satan is trying to do. This is what the world system does, is to intertwine you with it so much, and then you just hear story after story of people whose lives don't immediately become like death, but it eventually gets there because all of these worries and cares of the world, like Jesus says in the parable of the soils, choke out fruitfulness. That's what they end up doing. So instead of producing fruit, as everything ends up dying, and then people end up far from the Lord and uninterested in the things of the Lord. And even waking up and going to church to spend time with God's people and worship God for an hour just seems like such a burden. Or even if you have the time to do it, some people just don't even have the freedom to do that, and then it kind of almost becomes like a lamentable modern day version of, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane pouring his heart out, and his disciples are sleeping, and he says, you couldn't even stay awake with me for 1 hour to pray. Like, you couldn't even give me 1 hour. And it's because other things have complicated our lives so much, and we haven't planned to avoid those things. So we get swept along by the world system. And politics is the same thing. The political system is just the world. It is. We might tend to think that our political party is morally good and the other side is morally evil, but in reality, it's all a function of the world. And throughout human history, Satan has used human governments to create incredible amounts of evil and atrocious evils. And this is because the politics is, and governments are, tyrannical world system rulers. These are the rulers of this world. The people who put Jesus to death. Of course, obviously it was all of us. It was everyone took a part. But this was the Roman government and the Jewish government that put Jesus to death, and maybe thinking that they were acting righteously, but this was the world system. This is what the world system is capable of. And so when we realize that the state, the government, is not our friend, it is a tool in the hands of Satan. So we can enter into politics, but you never should enter into that, like you should never enter into anything else, with the assumption that this is a morally neutral tool that I can just passively take in hand and use for God's purpose. If you are not absolutely convinced in your mind, in your walk with the Lord, that what you're doing, that you are wading into enemy territory, when you're entering into politics and you go in with your mind on autopilot, you will be, again, not planning not to not make a mess of your life, and you'll be caught unawares by the world system. And so you kind of see this in our modern day political climate. It's becoming more and more aware that it's becoming more and more apparent that these people are not our friends. The state is not our friend. We may have been enamored by politicians and the government and the state, and thought, wow, this is a source for good, and I think that has been traditionally a problem that the church has fallen into, is trusting that the world system will accomplish the purposes of God. It won't. The state is a tool of the world system, which is a system set up by Satan. The state is not your friend. And I think operating in our world with the assumption that the state is not your friend is paramount. Now, you can see this. I saw a clip, just as kind of wrapping up in these last couple minutes. I saw this clip that I thought, wow, that perfectly illustrates that perfectly illustrates how the world is not your friend. The state is not your friend. And I'm currently reading through The Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard, and he has this quote. I'll read this and then I'll play this clip and see if you can see how the mask drops a little bit, and you can see how the world or the state is not your friend. So this quote first from Murray Rothbard says, "For this essential acceptance, the majority must be persuaded by ideology that their government is good, wise, and at least inevitable, and certainly better than other conceivable alternatives. Promoting this ideology among the people is the vital social task of the intellectuals. For the masses of men do not create their own ideas, or indeed think through these ideas independently. They follow passively the ideas adopted and disseminated by the body of intellectuals. The intellectuals are, therefore, the opinion molders in society. And since it is precisely a molding of opinion that the state most desperately needs, the basis for age-old alliance between the state and the intellectuals becomes clear. The greatest danger to the state is independent intellectual criticism. There is no better way to stifle that criticism than to attack any isolated voice, any raiser of new doubts, as a profane violator of the wisdom of his ancestors. Another potent ideological force is to deprecate the individual and exalt the collectivity of society. A conspiracy theory can unsettle the system by causing the public to doubt the state's ideological propaganda. So the state, which is a manifest tool of the world system, is propped up and legitimized by the intellectuals in our society. So once you start to realize that, wait a second, the intellectuals are not my friends, they don't have my spiritual best at heart, and they are operating on behalf of the manifest version of the world system, which is the state, to prop up that and legitimize the state, you start to realize, oh, wait a second, I should not be listening to these people with an uncritical mind. I should be viewing them as enemy territory when I engage with them. So you can listen to this quote, which again I thought was very profound, and it's about a minute and a half long, so I will play it now.
50% of Americans get their news from Facebook. Would we allow CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite in the 60s, when he was so dominant in the 70s, to deliberately spread lies, channel them through Russia, or deliberately spread healthcare lies? I think the government would pull their FEC license. Why can't we pass basic regulations to make these companies be more transparent about the algorithms that spread the lies on everything from COVID to January the 6th?
We absolutely should be able to pass them. We actually have to pass them. I think these social media companies are in many ways the tobacco companies of this era. They're exploiting loopholes in the law to deeply damage America. It just connects to your cancer metaphor.
Yes.
And with little to no regulation. And so we absolutely have to do it. The reason that it is hard is it is right now not in the interest of a lot of Republicans to do it. If you go to Facebook on a daily basis, the posts with the most engagement are from Ben Shapiro, Dan Bongino, Candace Owens. It is right-wing content. It dwarfs progressive content. It dwarfs mainstream media content, which is actually should be the part that scares us the most, that Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire has more followers and engagement, many times more than the New York Times or CNN. That is a problem for democracy.
So are you saying that, like, the Republican agenda is backed up by the freaks on Facebook, and so they don't want to do anything about it?
Absolutely.
So you heard that. He compares. And that was from Morning Joe, and at the end there was Mika Brzezinski, the co-host. You heard him talk about comparing, the media to like these tobacco executives, and actually there's one of my favorite quotes is by a guy named Michael Malice, and he says, "The battle is won when the average American regards a corporate journalist exactly as they would regard a tobacco executive." And so that's kind of the mentality that I'm talking about, is you can engage with the media, right wing, left wing, centrist, it doesn't matter, but you realize that these are corporations selling you a product. That is their goal. Their goal is not to help you or make you a better person. Their goal is to sell you a product, and their products are ideas. And the ideas are, by and large, meant to prop up and legitimize the state, which is, again, it is just the world system. That is, it's supposed to get you to buy into and view as legitimate the state and the world system. And so you heard what they said. It's these people who have these, well, kind of like Murray Rothbard said, these people who have these individualized voices, they must be stomped out. So as people who have views that are saying, well, no, I don't trust the state, I don't trust the world system, I don't believe what you're telling me, and I have something that I believe that is contrary, that belief can't be tolerated, because again, the world isn't our friend. And so as Christians, we might believe things that are contrary to what the world teaches, and we are viewed then as an enemy, which we are, properly understood. We are an enemy against the world system. And again, this doesn't mean we're enemies of the individual people. Remember, the people in the world system are just as victimized as anybody else. They're victims of what Satan is doing. So we don't view them as the enemy. Remember, Paul says our battle isn't against flesh and blood, but against rulers and principalities, demonic forces. So we don't view the intellectuals themselves as the enemies. We view the system as the enemy. And so we don't uncritically listen to media. But did you catch at the end there when Mika Brzezinski said these freaks on Facebook are the problem? Again, it's kind of the mask is dropping, and she's explicitly saying, you who might have a dissenting voice and a dissenting belief and a dissenting opinion from what the intellectuals, who are agents of the state, they're the propagandist of the state, they're the mouthpiece of the state and the world system. If you contradict them, you are a freak that needs to be quieted down, censored, shut down, whatever their recourse might be towards your opinion. So those are some examples to just see. And once your eyes become opened, and this is obviously an ongoing battle, I mean, we are constantly having to pray to have our spiritual eyes illuminated to see, man, because again, loving the world system is a spiritual issue, right? I mean, if you were deceived by the world, you wouldn't know it. So we need to have an outside objective view, namely God and the Holy Spirit of God living inside of us, to let us know, hey, we're touching the world system here. We need to be careful, because when we enter into it, again, uncritically, like Andy Stanley says, we don't plan to mess up our lives, but we don't plan not to. And so we just interact with the world with no plan in mind to fervently walk with the Lord, and we get swept along in this current that Satan has set up by the intellectual class, by our love for the state and the government, and believing that the government can save us and rescue us. We get caught up financially by complicating our lives with unnecessary entanglements with the world system. Financially, we become hamstrung, basically, to the point where we become a slave to the world system. We have no easy way out to free ourselves. And so I think this is a major problem that the church has to address, that Christians need to address, is trying to really critically teach Christians to critically evaluate the world system and to try to think, wait a second, if I engage in this, and this, and this, and this behavior, all of which individually might be relatively benign, but in totality create a slave system in which is designed to draw me from God, then hopefully we can be in a position to actually walk with God rather than be enslaved by the world system. Be in a position to have the love of the Father in us and living through us rather than being entangled with the love of the world system. So that is this episode of Faith in Focus on not loving the world system, and hopefully you enjoyed it. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission. If you like what you heard on this episode, why don't you become a monthly supporter of the ministry? It really helps me out. $10 a month, or whatever the Lord lays on your heart. So if you're interested in becoming a partner, you can text the word discipleship to 41444, or head over to infaith.org/Dennis-Sotheby. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to address on a future episode of Faith in Focus, why don't you shoot me an email? You can email me at dennissoutherby@infaith.org. Just put in the subject line, question for Faith in Focus or something like that. So I can see it, know that it's from you, and know that it's an issue that you would like me to address.